Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of the Breakpoint, I want to revisit base drafting. I got a lot of comments that people were interested in learning more, but some were afraid that it would be impractical with over 100 bases and counting. I'll get to that in a second, but after an event like March Smashness, let me just say that maintaining the base deck has been a nightmare. Some decks have gotten to be 40 or 48 bases deep, depending on Munchkin and the core set, and it creates a ton of overhead in setup. The majority of my games are played strictly by the base rules, especially anything official, but I'm getting really tired of how much work it is. It's been a while since I've done this, since most of my games are for work-related purposes these days, but I still feel like the idea holds up, signs in the stars aside. I know many players like to use just the faction bases, but that doesn't work either. As I mentioned in a previous video, base ownership is pretty arbitrary, and in two-player games, it can be really predictable. I don't like the certainty and the inevitability, and there have been games where I've used process of elimination to my advantage. This is why I've long enjoyed drafting bases, and the purpose of this video is to show that it's not as hard as people think. The truth is, there are many bases that I would never draft under any circumstance, and I find myself going back to the same bases per faction. There is almost a set list to choose from for each faction, and I'll speak more about that at the end of the video. But to prove the overall concept, I want to look at the core set bases and determine whether they are draft worthy and who would want them. I won't necessarily talk about how many bases per player and in what order, because I think that's something you decide for yourselves. But my general advice would be to use the faction bases as a starter and augment them with a certain number of bases of your choosing. If you store the bases with the faction, it wouldn't be hard to do this. It honors the spirit of the organization while adding drafting and depth. In general, it's important to consider all aspects of the base, not just its ability. The VP split and Breakpoint, as well as the ratio between the two, are very important to some factions. For each base, I'm going to assign a score from 0 to 1, indicating how likely the base would be drafted. 0 would never be drafted, and 1 would frequently be drafted, with varying levels of occasion in between. One last thing before I begin. I'm introducing this as a suggested variant, not a house rule. I'm not sure if there is a difference, but there is one to me. There are a lot of house rules that I disagree with, particularly in this game. Playing with one less base? Absolute insanity. But you'll notice that this doesn't affect the gameplay or balance outside of the setup. You are still playing by the normal rules, but are embracing the analytical nature of the game and adding new depth to the idea bases. Let's look at the core set, starting with the aliens and Homeworld. This is one of the bases that most elicits an emotional response from me when it comes out, either extreme elation or extreme trepidation. It's also one of the most misplayed bases in the game, but there is no denying that it provides value to so many factions. This could be an entire episode unto itself because it has so many use cases. Anyone who specializes in low-powered minions, dropping many at a time, will love this base. It's perfect for the locals, particularly if you have Return to the Sea. With the halflings, I love playing Lunch Run on this base, particularly both copies. There are a few infinite combos with the Homeworld, but the Halfling Minions of Cthulhu one lets you get infinite VP and draw your entire deck, which was really fun for the first 5 minutes. This is one of the few times I actually like Winds of Change with the Wizards, after you've played all their minions on this base, because you could potentially get it solo. There are too many examples to name, but this would be a highly frequent draft target. For the Mothership, there isn't a whole lot that is special about this base. The Breakpoint is reasonable for its first place VP, but there are lower examples. It comes down to the ability, which sounds better on paper than it is. Returning a minion to your hand is great, but it's power capped, and the best targets will often exceed that. Power counter or action-based factions won't be able to utilize this much, so you need a faction that has a standout 2 or 3 worthy of returning. My best example is probably Tiny Priestesses, because getting access to Gorgonzola again is fantastic. There are many other great kaiju bases, but at least this one doesn't benefit similar action-oriented factions. So I think there are cases when this would be drafted, but they are minor. Moving on to the dinosaurs, I really like Jungle Oasis. It's a frequent terraforming target because it's one of the few bases where I can gain VP and no one else. This is important because it's a way to catch up when you were severely behind on VP. I've seen many players overspend on it or inadvertently give the base away, but I do enjoy this base. Opposing movement factions are great because you don't need to bring much over, especially if you have Snow White. The steampunks are great with this base because they can set up much of the work in advance without adding any power. If you have a faction with a high value big drop in just 2 cards, this is a great base to have out. I'd say this is a common target. Tar Pits is another common terraforming target because it's very low breakpoint for 4 VP. Because of its low breakpoint, they aren't going to get many minions on this base, which makes it easy to remove a player as the base is scoring. Spies and cowboys come to mind, particularly if the deputies are used to suddenly increase the power of the sheriff before it scores, then dueling a lone minion to get an easy 4 points unanswered. For the aliens, terraforming and using your Supreme Overlord as the extra minion to remove a player's sole minion can accomplish the same effect. I also like this base because it's 4-3-2, because it means I don't have to keep any minions alive for very long. This is important for strategic second place factions, particularly if you break it on your turn. If the breakpoint is too high, I either need to commit early or run the risk of losing my minion on successive turns, or wait for a moment that may not come. The elves have a great helping hands play here because it's not hard to get to 16 with their power boosts, only to get 1 more VP in the end. Of my choices for 4-3-2, this may be one of the most frequent. Now for ninja bases, the very type of bases that need this concept. Ironically, if you could draft any, I don't know if I'd draft these particular 2, when Wintersquashed gives you more VP. However, if you were playing the Sumos or Bear Cavalry or Geeks, or anyone with a lot of opponent movement, maybe you want to stack the deck to ensure that they come out. With these types of bases, the factions are pretty clear on who would benefit, and if you aren't in that criteria, you skip over it entirely. I don't make much of a difference between the two, as most of the time I care about the points, not necessarily the ability. Feel free to make your own preference. But with Wintersquashed and the Great White North, you may not need these at all, so it's possible that they get skipped automatically as well. Moving on to the pirates, the Grey Opal is one of the few bases that benefits the losers, and there is actually a place for that. Not often, but occasionally. This is another great helping hands base because of its relatively low breakpoint and the fact that there is incentive to lose. Put a Fae Fighter there, allow him to get powered up, lose intentionally, and move a high-powered minion elsewhere only for you to both get 2 VPs, but you get the better end of the deal. This base is much less likely to be drafted, but on occasion it will make sense. As for Tortuga, this base's ability is surprisingly convoluted and impossible to predict. I'll admit that in my group, we played this wrong for the first year or so, thinking it was like the Grey Opal when it's not. It pulls from other bases, and while there may be reasons to do that, it rarely happens and is impossible to predict. I suppose the explorers could make use of that because they know what is coming, but there are other bases I like much more, and the breakpoint isn't particularly spectacular, so I'd say this base is pretty useless. For the robots, I think it's obvious that Factory 4361337 is highly desirable, because when it comes out, it tends to grab everyone's attention and often determine the game. Not always, but often. And when I end up with a really crazy score like 16-0, this base is usually involved. For the Central Brain, this is another base that Swarm factions want, because of how quickly it breaks. I think it pertains to a different type of swarm, extra play style swarms. Factions that can add many minions quickly, such as the Rockstars or Teddy Bears, will like this base because it increases the chance of breaking it in a single turn. I once broke the Central Brain on the first turn of a game by myself, a great way to start a tournament and make several enemies in the process. Some might argue that it works as a counter to destruction-based factions because it moves minions out of destruction range, but I'd rather pick a base that avoids it entirely. So this base has its value, but I wouldn't draft it often, and I like other swarm options more. For the Tricksters, Cave of Shinies speaks for itself. There are times where you want Field of Honor and times where you want Cave of Shinies, but I particularly like this base with self-destructive minions. Superheroes, killer plants, minions of Cthulhu, even vampires get more of an incentive for destroying their own minions. Mushroom Kingdom is really interesting because it has a favorable breakpoint for 5 VP and lets you manipulate other minions. I love this base with Snow White because it can make someone really overpay for second place, or as ninjas, really overpay for first place, especially if you throw a shinobi on at the last minute as your first minion. As the bear cavalry with high ground, this is devastating, particularly if other players take advantage of it as well. Because you can pull minions in, the Mountie Major can use that to his advantage as well. It's also one of the few bases that can get past Yokozuna, so it has value as a counterpick as well. For the wizard bases, these are about as vanilla as they get. I don't like either of these bases, and couldn't recommend drafting them at all. School of Wizardry has a suboptimal ability and a bad VP split. Why not just draft the bases that School of Wizardry would reveal? Possibly the Ancient Incas might want it, but you still have to break it first, and that's a chore. The Great Library is nothing special, as everyone gets to draw a card, even 4th place, and the breakpoint is too high. If you wanted a single card, there are much better options, and I cannot think of a single reason why this specific base is better than any other, so eliminate these two from contention entirely. Finally, the zombies. Swarm factions will love Rhodes Plaza Mall. Like the Robot Factory, this is a game-changing, attention-grabbing base, and you can dominate a game if you dominate this base. Robots, mythic horses, Innsmouth, rockstars, teddy bears. So many factions will want this base that I might even put it in a separate pile. For the last base, I don't actually like Evan City's Cemetery. Not even for the zombies. Not even for the ghosts. I cannot recall a single time where I won this base and was happy about having to discard my hand, even if I draw up to 5. If there was a good outcome, it was likely situational and not driven by any faction. The possible exception is if I infiltrated on the last turn, because I'm the only one immune to the ability, but this means relying on minions to win on my turn, which is very difficult with the ninjas. I don't like it with ghosts or zombies. It's not worth 1 counter for a top tier, and it doesn't help the mages. So if it doesn't help discard factions, it won't help anyone else, and even though the VP split is favorable, Mushroom Kingdom has the same split. I'd pass on this base. So assigning points to everyone, the aliens get 1 for Homeworld, and a quarter for Mothership. Dinosaurs get the full 2 points, ninjas get a combined point for their 2 bases, the pirates get a half point for the Grey Opal, the robots get 1 point for the factory, and a quarter point for the central brain. Tricksters get the full 2 points, wizards get nothing, and zombies get 1 point for Rhodes Plaza Mall, nothing for Evan City Cemetery. That's a total of 9 points out of 16, and many of those points were automatic that pertain to a significant number of factions. For this idea to work, I don't want everyone to have to go through every base to decide their draft value. Instead, one of my goals for this year is to augment the Smash Up binder on our Facebook page with suggestions for each faction. Each faction should come with 4 or 5 good base targets that would make sense to draft, and then players can tailor them to their specific combinations. This would speed up the process significantly and allow more customization and control in the game. If you still want a bit more uncertainty, consider randomly adding in a few bases and drafting extra, then removing a few out. This way you never really know what's coming, and it's a good way of depowering cards like terraforming. Unfortunately, I don't have a good way of achieving the former from an organization standpoint, because uncertainty only works if you don't know what the cards are, and that requires the bases to be centrally located. This is why I prefer the draft in, shuffle out method for uncertainty. So that's base drafting in a nutshell. It will take some time for the next version of the binder to have the suggestions, but I'm hoping to have it finished by the end of summer. I'll make an announcement when it's ready, and until then, I encourage you to try it out and think of your own examples. There are quite a few bases that never make sense to draft, so don't be concerned about the total number of bases. In light of this, how do you feel about base drafting? It won't be for everyone, but try it and tell me what you think. There's nothing like the feeling of a game-changing base coming out. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.